The woman looked at the man with the stick who was walking towards her. She thought about the fact that she had never loved him. Looking at her, he asked what it was and if he looked uglier up close. Taking her by the hand, the man asked if that was not why she cheated on him, because the Baron was very handsome. He also asked whether that snake had promised her eternal love. With tears in her eyes, the woman shouted, so that he would think that he liked and that she did not care. Eyes wide with anger, he told her to think whatever she wanted, but he was still her husband. She looked up at him, questioning in surprise, and then she asked if he really thought he had the right to call himself that, because he had never acted like her husband. He was even more outspoken when he heard that their marriage was over. The man squeezed the woman's hand tighter, asking if she really loved him, but then, when she did not answer, said that the girl had nowhere to go from him. When the girl tried to pull her hand away, he gripped her tighter, saying that she wouldn't go anywhere, even if this house collapsed, because she belonged to him. But she only asked why he did that. Turning, the girl walked away as she pulled out her hand and said that she would no longer stay in this house and that she would not live here as a ghost for the rest of her life. She ran down the stairs, saying that he wouldn't make her stay and thinking about the love question he asked, if she loved, but it was only revenge for him, Ian Nottingham. The next moment, the girl was lying on the floor in a pool of her own blood. She cried, thinking that she had endured so much, but would remain an unfaithful wife. The last thing the girl saw was the Earl of Nottingham sobbing desperately, standing on the floor on his knees. At last, she smiled, thinking that she would be fine with that too, if he felt despair even for a second. The girl sat in front of the mirror and thought she was ready to meet Hades, but she was far from the afterlife and was now being combed by a maid at Roanfield Manor, and she was 17 again. The maid asked, while the girl was reading the newspaper, if she was all right. But she said that the girl should not pretend because she had been sick recently and that they were worried whether it was some serious illness. She was looking at the newspaper as she heard the maid ask if she was really all right, because she had never read a newspaper before. And she looked at the year, 1914, the year when her misfortunes began. She recalled that when her mother died, she and her father lived well and even happily, and herself, who loved her dresses then, and that was her only problem. When they lost their fortune through a business failure, she found her father hanged in his office, standing in the doorway. The girl remembered that then she found her father's will on the floor, but it did not say a word about his own daughter, so she had to do something. So she married the Count, whom she had never seen. She held out her bloody hand, thinking that both had dragged each other into an abyss of despair and that their marriage had ended so tragically. After going for a walk, the girl thought that if she were 17 again, they would soon lose their fortune, but if she persuades her father not to invest there, she will be able to change the future. She thought that her father was currently on a world tour and was not saving money, but the fact that he did not mention her in his will was surprising. Madeline looked up in surprise when she heard her father calling her. He looked out of the carriage, saying that he was glad that his daughter had come out to meet him. As she got into the carriage, she thought that she owed her father a good life, but she must avoid meeting Ian at all costs, Nottingham. She was looking at the man looking out the window, turning away when her father said he wanted to introduce her to someone. To her, after her father introduced the man as Ian Nottingham, a healthy and handsome man returned, not as she remembered him. The girl sat as if immersed in water when her father stretched himself in front of the Count and talked about his tight schedule. Nottingham said he had no difficulty, though he did not look very pleased at the invitation and the visit. While the girl thought that the last time he had been in London at this time, the Earl said with a smile that he had heard that her father's last investment had been very successful. She couldn't believe that the man in front of her was Ian Nottingham, because she had never seen him like that. Madeline remembered what he was like in her past life. He shouted, was a tyrant, and did not even remotely resemble the man sitting across from her. The girl recalled that when she touched him, he fell to his knees, and servants ran to him to help. Squinting her eyes, Madeline thought that the man in front of her now was far from the man she had known in the past, and she didn't know how to feel about it. While she was thinking about her own, her father asked the Count about horse racing, and he said that he adored horse sports, which made his husband very happy. The girl kept thinking that this guy likes horse racing, doesn't limp, and doesn't raise his voice at her. In her past life, she was sitting in a wedding dress with a bouquet of flowers and did not look very cheerful at her own wedding. The butler asked if she was worried, and the girl unenthusiastically replied that she was a little worried. The man said that His Eminence was a good man and told her not to be afraid. But Madeline said that she was not afraid, but she was only thinking about whether she could be a good wife. Thinking back to that evening, when she sat on the bed and looked out the window, she thought that, although she did not love the Count, she wanted to have a good marriage and be a beacon for her wounded husband. She stayed up until the morning of their wedding night, and he never came, shattering her dreams of a perfect marriage. She remembered how the maid kept her company, and the Count did not want to spend a second with her. This time she was sitting in the garden. In the evening, she stood next to the Earl of Nottingham, saying that he seemed to have forgotten her existence. He did not even tear himself away from the papers he was looking at, saying that this was not true at all. Madeline frowned, looking at her husband, and said that she was bored alone. The next morning she saw the puppy, which she was told was a gift from His Eminence. The butler was holding a puppy on a leash, which was trembling while sitting next to him. Sitting down opposite the puppy, the girl looked at him and wondered if the Count was really giving her a dog so that she wouldn't be bored. When the puppy licked her hand, the girl scooped him up in her arms and held him close. She shed a tear because the puppy was as scared as she was. When they arrived, his father talked about their estate, saying that few people in their country built in the Renaissance style, while Ian looked at the house. Her father asked if Madeline would like to show the Count the estate while the refreshments were being prepared, but the girl slouched and said she was not feeling well. When her father asked her to play the piano, the Earl of Nottingham stared at her. When the father began to protest, because the girl told about her well-being, Ian held out his hand and said that he did not mind. Putting his hand to his heart and bowing, the Count said that he was very glad to meet you. Madeline bowed her head, saying she apologized for not being able to play. She thought that in front of her was Yen, who was not yet broken by misfortune, and, seeing him like this, she thought that she should not interfere in his life at all. Turning around under her father's gaze, she thought that they should not get closer for their common good. The girl looked at the documents, thinking about the fact that the estate and land had to be sold before the start of the war. If they save money and move to the village, they will last. She thought that her father should be forced to throw money and play, but she was distracted. A knock on the door made her turn her head. It was Dad who looked into the room and asked if he could come in. She happily returned to the door, saying that she was going to go to her father on her own soon. He put a sealed envelope on the table, saying it was an invitation to London for her. Father said with a sweet smile that now is the time to debut in high society. Thinking that now was not the time for balls, she asked aloud if she really had to make her debut, exhaling noisily. She even asked, stopping the cup halfway to her mouth when her father asked if she was unhappy. And then she calmly continued to drink tea when her father said that she reads a lot of books, constantly tells him to spend less money, and now she does not want to get married at all. Father began to shout that refusing to debut was like refusing to get married, especially since he even bought them a townhouse in London to make it more convenient. When she said that the house had to be sold, he shouted that his daughter should not be a fool. And she also reminded him not to forget about the investment in the criminal case, which made him start to become silent, asking how she found out about it. To her surprise, he jumped off the sofa and shouted, asking if she had read his letters and saying it was very low of her. Hearing that it was not a matter of the girl's mind, she simply looked coldly at her father. Madeline threw away the invitation that her father had given, saying that if he did not listen to her, she would not even look towards the higher world and marry. With a sweet smile, she added that if he resisted, she would have a nun's haircut without a twinge of conscience. Father was shaking from the anger that was written on his face when he heard this. He said she was not allowed to leave the room until she apologized. After some time, there was a ball in London. Everyone danced and had fun, while somewhere in the background of the fun, Madeline asked her father if he really burned the contract. While her father said yes, because she had been on his mind all this time, she asked if he still had copies. Assuring her not, he asked her to finally dance with someone. The girl said that she was not yet sure whether she wanted it, and she did not look very happy. Madeline heard that she, as the heiress of the family, had the duty to marry successfully. She let out a breath, glumly thinking that this prom season wouldn't end anyway because the war would start. Imagining herself as a doll being pulled by strings, the girl told herself that she no longer wanted to play the role of this doll. Looking somewhere on top of all the fun, she thought about the fact that it was necessary to do so in order to save the family from collapse. She smiled, thinking that she could learn to play the piano further, and then she could find a job. But Nottingham appeared next to her, holding a glass of wine in his hand and saying that she seemed to be someone who did not really like balls and receptions. The girl looked at him in surprise, unable to believe that it was Yen Nottingham in its own person. Turning her head sharply so as not to look at him, she said that it was not so. But she asked if it did not seem strange to him. But the man said that he did not see anything strange, because everyone was just having fun from the heart. Madeline seriously said that she was mad, because they were having fun until they knew what the future held for them. And the Count laughed, saying that there was a grain of truth in her words. But he said that no one knows their future, so everyone is having fun and seizing the moment, and suggested the girl to relax. The girl frowned a little when the Count said that sometimes you need to relax, which people do. She said that she does not tell others not to do this, but for her all these holidays are a simple waste of time and she does not like it. But he asked with a smile if she wanted to dance with him, which attracted the girl's attention. To her surprise, he bowed with his hand on his chest and asked if she would give him a dance. The girl looked at him and thought that she was not obliged to save anyone, especially Gina. She thought that she should use a second chance at life to save herself from him. Looking at him smiling, Madeline thought that if she didn't do anything now, he would go to war and come back injured. He would come crippled not only in body, but also in soul, so she had to push him in the right direction. She could then give him advice to help. One of the guests of the ball turned around, pointing at the girl, and the other asked which one to look at, because she was having a lot of fun here. But the first one said that he counted how many men and ladies he had already sent away. Looking at Madeline, the guy with the cigar said that she had lost 6. She just debuted and is not as desperate as the others, but not exactly beautiful. But the Count of Nottingham looked surprised in the direction of the girl the boy was pointing to, because she was Roanfield's daughter. The third guy asked if he could approach her, and the first guy said that he didn't even know her, so it was very rude. But the boy shouted at the back of the Earl of Nottingham when he pushed the boy away and went to the girl. The cigar boy said with a smile that he didn't think he would live to see the day when Ian Nottingham himself will approach some lady. The girls immediately looked at the couple dancing, discussing the fact that the two were dancing their 4th dance, and the other asked who she was, because she was dancing with the Count himself. The man asked if she was okay, stopping the dance. He noted her hands, saying they were shaking. While everyone around them was busy, the Count said that her hands were shaking very much and that she was looking at him as if she was sorry. The girl was thinking whether to tell him everything or to let go of his hand and never regret anything. Meanwhile, another dancing couple approached them. The Count took the girl by the hand and held her by the waist so that she would not fall from a collision with another girl. Looking back, she looked at the falling rose and thought that if their destinies were to intertwine again, she would have to go through years of loneliness. She fantasized about being older when she was 26. She looked at the rosebush, which she adored very much. While the dog ran nearby, the girl looked at the broken rose and wondered who had done it, because everyone knew how much she cared for the rose garden. The dog yapped cutely when Madeline asked if she did it. The girl told the dog that she hoped that whoever cut the rose got at least a little joy from the flower. It was raining hard, but Madeline ran and looked for Corey, while the servants ran after her and begged her to return to the estate. The girl angrily returned, telling Sebastian to go back to the house he was offering her, and she would look for her dog herself. While they were arguing and the butler said that he was not taking care of her for the Earl's sake, when Sir Nottingham himself appeared. He told his wife to return to the estate, and when she cried for the dog, he simply told her to forget about him. The Count said that it was only an animal, although a mask of pity froze on his face. He said that he could not allow a person to get sick because of a dog. She screamed, asking how he could, because it was he who gave the dog and that the dog was the only one who cared about her in this house. The Count came up and, putting his hands on her shoulders and squeezing them a little, called her. She was crying in the rain, looking into his eyes, when the Count ordered her to go into the house. Madeline blushed as the Earl of Nottingham called her to the ball, placing his hands on her shoulders. The girl took her hand from the man's hand and turned to leave, saying that she was fine. After bowing, she said that she was glad to meet you and said goodbye, wishing her a good night. Looking after her, the Count was talking to himself, saying that the girl had not warmed to him even after 4 dances. Although he was smiling, he told himself that he was disappointed. Madeline had thought that avoiding the Earl in a tight circle would be problematic. But now, sitting across from him at the table, she didn't think it would be that difficult. Calmly sipping from her glass, the girl thought that she definitely did not want to be part of the conversation in raised tones. While Isabel was speaking quite loudly, the Earl of Nottingham asked her to lower her voice and stop shouting. The girl shouted, questioning whether she really shouldn't give in to emotions, because she also heard that she was being influenced by that nobody. Madeline remembered that she was Isabel in her past life. Nottingham, Ian's sister, died in an accident before the war, but it was rumored that it was no accident. While the boy next to him was telling something, the girl kept thinking that Ian could be less unhappy if he had at least one living relative. In her past life, she once sat down at the piano, which Lady Isabel used to play on. She was interested and wanted to play. She then looked around, seeing that there was not a single gram of dust in the room, because the premises were well taken care of. Madeline picked up a photograph that had fallen from nowhere and saw Lady Isabel on it, but she did not know who was next to her. She read the dedication to Zachary on the back Myloff, whom, judging by the text, she loved. The girl put the photo back, but noticed something else. The sheet music was made by hand because, judging by everything, Isabel wrote this melody herself. She missed Isabel, although she did not know her, but she wanted to know. As she began to play that melody on the piano, Madeline thought that the sounds of Isabel's song must have breathed life into even this gloomy estate. But in the middle of the melody, the door of the room opened with a sharp bang, and on the threshold was the amorous Count. He was shaking with anger and ordered the girl to get out of here. Standing up, Madeline clenched her fist in exasperation, saying that she was his wife, and if he had an ounce of respect for her, he would explain why. But he, bowing his head, said that she should never again enter this room. Sitting at the table now, she thought he was reacting like that because of his attachment to his sister, but now they were ready to grab each other's throats, and Isabel kept screaming. Standing up with a sharp movement, she shouted that it was he, her brother, nothing. The girl, walking away, said that she had too little air in his presence. Remembering how the woman looked at the time of her death, which was written about in the newspapers, she understood. Today is the day when Isabel must die Nottingham. The guy sitting next to her said that they often fight now and did so with a smile when Madeline stood up and apologized. The boy shouted, trying to stop her, as the girl followed Lady Isabel, the Earl watching her back with interest. She ran down the stairs trying to yell at Lady Isabel to stop her. The lady rolled her eyes when she heard the question about her beloved because no one knew about him and it surprised her. Returning, Isabel shouted, asking and accusing the girl of eavesdropping on her conversation with her brother. She said that her brother was always surrounded by unscrupulous women who would do anything for his attention, so she was sure that she was eavesdropping. Madeline cried out in despair, asking if she was going to Mr. Myloff. Returning to the stranger, she haltingly asked how she knew about him. The blonde told the lady not to worry because she won't tell anyone, because she doesn't understand anything about socialism or whatever it's called. But Lady Isabel could not believe it, asking if the girl was not her brother's informant. Isabel, when Madeline said that the Count, although a gentleman, is stubborn, said that she would not call him a gentleman, but he knows how to manipulate people. The girl looked at the stranger in surprise and bewilderment and said that she probably knew her brother very well. Barely holding her hand, Madeline desperately begged her not to succumb to the provocations of the Earl of Nottingham and his desire to control everything. Closing her eyes, she remembered her past life and said that she once gave in to a man and it ruined her life. Thinking about how she squeezed Isabel's hand, not worried about the fact that she might get confused with Ian again, she just wanted to save the woman in front of her. Madeline said that there are many paths that the girl has not yet tried, so you should not follow the lure of emotions. Someone was watching them from above, seeing how Isabel agreed to something and asked the blonde to finally let go of her hand. Yen Nottingham watched this scene with interest and unblinking. The girls turned at the sound of footsteps, silently looking at the Count in response. On the way down, he asked the girl to leave because it was between him and her sister, but Isabel shouted no and asked the blonde her name again. She said her name was Madeline Roanfield, and immediately after that, Isabel shouted that she would stay with Miss Roanfield. The Count was puzzled, because Isabel had told him not to get into their affairs and that they would just talk. The blonde asked if the girl could let go of her hand already, but Isabel asked in response who was the first to grab her hands, hinting at her. Ian said that getting into other people's families was not the best thing to do, addressing Miss Roanfeld, and told his sister that every action had consequences and that she should remember that. Both girls looked at the Count in surprise, and it was clear from Isabel that she was getting angry. Closing her eyes, the girl thought she already knew, because he didn't even thank her for calming his sister down. Reading the newspaper in the morning, Madeline thought that everyone was just writing about Isabel that morning, but today the topics are different, so she concluded that Lady Nottingham was healthy. The girl couldn't hold back a smile, thanking God for being healthy and alive. She thought that there must have been no one to stop her last time, and that this must have been the last interaction between brother and sister. Closing her eyes and throwing her head back, the girl remembered that after that incident in Isabel's room, he gave the girl her own piano. Also, remembering his behavior back then, she thought that maybe Yen was just apologizing like that. Now, looking at the invitation, she thought that the next evening would be at the Kolkata estate. Looking at the people, she noticed that Yen was not present today, so she thought that she could make new acquaintances today and relax. Immediately after this thought, a young man appeared and held out his hand with a smile and asked if she was Miss Madeline Roanfield. What surprised the girl? Holding the boy's hand, she listened to the fact that the reception had to be arranged only for the sake of accompanying her. That girl remembered that he had broken many hearts in his past life. They stopped, looking at those gathered in the estate, and the boy asked if she was hungry, because they were just drinking tea before dinner. They sat down in the chairs, and the boy began to ask if she had been to Vienna and said that she would definitely like it there, because it is a modern and developed city. Handing the girl a glass of champagne, the boy said that the days in Vienna reminded him that humanity will always progress. Saying only what she understood, the girl thought that, unfortunately, the war would level this city to the ground. The girl looked surprised as someone intervened in their conversation, saying that he was not sure about Vienna and taking her champagne glass. It was Yen Nottingham, and behind were his brother and sister. People began to watch, and the boy even said that it looked like George was in the same class as Ian Nottingham. Madeline looked at Ian, seeing now that he was not alone. Isabel and Eric's brother were with him. He just sat down next to George, greeting him and saying that she had not seen him for a long time. Apparently, they were happy to see each other. Lady Isabel sat across from her and looked warily at the girl in front of her. At the same time, George asked if they disagreed with the theory, but Eric said that he was not sure that the people would continue their peaceful progress. Ian added thoughtfully that humans are built for competition and will always choose competition. Ironically, he said, it was precisely because of this that they had made such progress. But while Madeline regretfully listened to the correct theories of Ian, Isabel got up from her seat and was going to go somewhere. But George said that war was impossible now because the world was more economically united than ever. But the Count said with a smile that he did not agree, because if such a need arose, a new military conflict would be unleashed. Turning back to the girl, Ian noticed her looking at him with a smile, and to her surprise asked what she thought. She said that military power was part of progress, but asked if it could justify the millions of lives lost for such progress. She clutched her dress from memories of the past. Ian listened with interest as she thought he was right in his opinion, but there was something she didn't agree with. Looking at him seriously and unblinking, Madeline said that wars are started by people who believe in necessary evil. With a smile, after a short pause, the man said that this is what the lady thought Roanfeld on War and Progress. Now everyone was looking at her, having left their conversations, and the girl wondered if she had been too frank when she spoke her mind. Eric saved the day by saying he didn't have time to talk politics, and asked if anyone was going to tennis at Wimbledon this year, and George asked if they were still playing tennis, and the brother began to praise Ian, saying that he plays perfectly. This conversation made the girl breathe a sigh of relief, because everyone had already forgotten about her words. While all the boys were talking about tennis and the rivalry on the court, Ian noticed that Madeline had quietly left the room, so he immediately followed her receding figure. Standing on the balcony and leaning on the railing, the girl thought that she didn't want to show so openly that she disagreed with Yen's opinion and scolded herself for it. Shaking her head, she thought he wasn't too upset about it as far as she could tell. She remembered the look on his face and the smile she'd seen then, and thought he might even like it as she did. In the garden, Madeline saw Isabel walking with her husband and laughing at something. Isabel's room in her past life, and realized that it was her beloved husband. Madeline smiled as she looked at the couple and realized that they looked so in love. Thinking that Isabel was even ready to die for the sake of her beloved, The girl also thought that she would like to love in the same way someday. Her attention was drawn by Yen, who forced her to turn to him. He asked if he could talk to her, and she thought that if he came closer, he would see Isabel. To his surprise, Madeline came closer herself until he even stopped, asking again if he could talk to her. He turned his head a little awkwardly to the side, saying that the topic of conversation would be what happened on their first meeting, and she asked, when exactly? He said that he should not have quarreled over his sister's helping hand. The girl went in the other direction, saying that there was nothing wrong, but she herself thought that Isabel was about to get caught and Ian had to be taken out of here. Standing with her back to her husband, Madeline asked him if the two of them could go into the house. He seriously told the girl that she was confusing him. Ian wasn't going to go in and said that she had been showing that she had no sympathy for him for some time now. Putting his hand thoughtfully to his face, he said that everything looked as if she despised him. Extending his hand to her, the man said that he could give up and hoped that her dislike would not get worse, because neither of them would benefit from it. Looking directly at her, puzzled by these words, he said that you never know what the future holds for them. And then he offered to go inside, because it is getting colder. But the girl said that his words sound as if only misfortune awaits them. Bowing, Madeline replied that he should go first, and she wanted to admire the scenery a little more. He nodded but asked, more stating that she was unwilling to open up to him even for a short period of time. Clenching his hand into a fist, Ian said that he respected her wishes and would leave her alone today, but he also said that he had no intention of backing down anymore. Looking at him, the girl thought how stupid they seemed to the couple in the garden, because Ian mistook obsession for love. She thought she couldn't give him hope, because he was standing there as if shielding her from the wind, but really he was just casting his shadow over her. In her past life, she sat on her bed and wondered how much longer she had to live like this, and what would happen to Corey, her dog, when she died. Madeline cried, thinking that the more important question for her was what would happen to herself when Corey died. The girl thought that she would go crazy if the dog left her alone in this godforsaken place, and that she was forced to exist here as a ghost for the rest of her life. She jumped to her feet with a sharp movement, thinking that she had a plan so that she would not spend the rest of her life in this hell alone. Clutching her trembling hands, she told the dog not to worry. He had nothing to worry about. The next morning, Yen Nottingham asked the butler what his wife had done, but more because he could not believe what he heard. After picking up Corey, the girl sat in the carriage, looking out the window, while the butler explained that in the morning she had left the estate under cover of darkness. Madeline sat in her chair and, looking at the couple in front of her, thought she couldn't believe it, because she was in a London cinema. She thought that she had managed to escape from the house and asked herself if there was a commotion, and how Yen was doing. The girl thought about whether Ian was happy that he was panting for her or upset. Madeline cried when they watched a movie with Charlie Chaplin about the child he raised as his own son. She covered her face with her hands. She came back into the room, and Corey immediately ran to her, barking, and Madeline apologized for leaving him for so long. As Corey ate his feed, the girl thought about how cool the movie was, and how the way the people moved on the wall was really mesmerizing. She asked the dog while he was still eating if he liked being free too. She looked at herself in the mirror, thinking about where to buy food for Corey and to mend her clothes, because the dress was dirty. On the other side of the door, she was told that she had received a telegram, but she was just under the door so that she could pick him up. With trembling hands, she opened it, where she read that it was from Ian. He said he would be waiting for her at the station. Looking at the paper, she thought that she had managed to escape if she had made it all the way to London. She rolled her eyes, thinking that it wasn't true, but then she asked herself why her heart had gone away. Now 17 again, she sat on a chair and watched the others dance. Bowing her head, she wondered why it was impossible to achieve anything in this world without inheritance or marriage. The girl thought that she looked more like a fool, because before her death, she had to remember at least a dozen companies in which she could invest money. But to her surprise, she felt someone touch her forehead. It was Yen Nottingham, who said that lately she constantly looks tired. He sat down next to her and said with a smile that maybe she didn't like the London air, while she looked at him in surprise. When she said she was tired from studying, the Count asked if she was studying ancient Greek or something. Remembering herself, who sat over the accounting books until night, Madeline joked that it was more like an ancient Greek tragedy. Ian couldn't understand, looking puzzled at the girl when she said she wanted to prevent the inevitability of fate. Blushing a little, She said she was thinking of how to provide for herself, while he bent down, surprising her even more, for noble women cared little for such things, and asked if it was not her father's business. She told him not to apologize when Ian started apologizing after the question, because her father's life was known even in London. She said that you should prepare for the worst. The man said that she should think more practically and find a person who will do all this for her. Madeline laughed, saying that she thought that was exactly what most people did. Bowing her head, she said that she simply did not want to depend on anyone. She asked the man if he ever hated himself so much that he began to hate others, turning his head towards him. Ian opened his mouth in surprise, asking why he should hate himself. The girl laughed and then apologized because it was very rude of her, but the man turned away from her and said that everything is normal. Blushing a little, she said that his attitude towards herself was worthy of approval. Ian opened the door, calling her name, but then corrected himself by calling her by her last name, as was proper etiquette. He brought the news that Mr. Rohnfeld was bankrupt. She looked at the man in front of her, feeling her life crumble. She ran around the estate asking where her father was. The maid, who was crying, said that His Eminence was in the room. Running up the stairs, the girl held her dress and asked how long he had been in the room, and the maid replied that it had been since lunch. She stopped, eyes widening with fear and memories, when she heard her father order no one to enter the room. She opened the door sharply, calling out to her father, while horror froze in her eyes. Father was sitting on the bed, and the butler was just feeding him something. Both looked at Lady Madeline in surprise. When the maid and the butler left, the father asked why she was so upset and reminded her to behave like a lady. Meanwhile, the lady recovered from fear. The girl told her father to forget about what she was nervous about and asked how it happened that he went bankrupt, because he burned all those contracts. The father fell on his face at his feet, saying that it was all because of him. She screamed when her father told her that he had invested all his money in a trading company that went bankrupt. Taking his daughter by the hand, Mr. Rohnfeld said that she was his last hope. She exhaled, thinking that she should be glad that her father had not done anything to himself, that she would be able to help him in some way while he was still alive. She stroked her father's hand, saying that the main thing is that he is healthy and alive, and they will overcome everything else together. When she was talking about selling the house and that they would go to work to repay the debt, he interrupted and said that the daughter should not be a fool, because why should a nobleman work? She began to lie, saying that they had only danced twice, when her father said that there were rumors that the Earl of Nottingham had taken a liking to her and that she should start looking for a husband. Now the girl was standing at another reception, looking sullenly somewhere in front of her. She thought how to convince her father that marriage with a money bag is not the key to happiness. She thought that all the houses could be sold, and they would survive somehow, but how would they earn a living then? Looking around at the others, she thought that now was not the best time to go to receptions. But if her father hadn't been bedridden, things would have been different. In front of her stood Mr. Peril, who asked if he remembered correctly, and she, Miss Rohnfeld. The girl bowed her head, and he said that he was glad that his so-called dinner was to her liking. He held out his hand to her, asking if he could ask her to the dance, as she stared in surprise at his man's outstretched hand. When Madeline refused, saying that she was not feeling well, he frowned, because he was definitely not used to being refused. Blushing with drink, he said that he had heard that there had been some misfortune in her family, but that Mr. Rohnfeld had nothing to worry about with her. The girl bowed while the man said that there was probably a line of men behind her, and she definitely didn't need him. Thinking that it would be worse to make the family situation worse by being rude to him, she only bowed and said that she was grateful for his advice. And then she widened her eyes in surprise when she heard Yen's voice. He came up with a glass of champagne and asked the host of the evening if he could turn on the music. He said, in the meantime, that he had a disgusting squealing in his ears, and that he was probably a drunken fool who did not know how to distinguish between unceremoniousness and advice. The man's eyes widened in fear when he heard this, until he began to fall silent. When the owner ran to turn on the music, the other guy told Ian that he literally attacked the poor owner and that he shouldn't have climbed. Hearing Nottingham say that he was not one to stand by, the girl felt awkward, but immediately looked at him. He frowned and asked why Ian was interested in something like that. To the Earl's malicious surprise, they were interrupted by Isabel, who grabbed Miss Rohnfeld by the arm and said they should look at the new dress catalogue that had just come out. As they walked further, Madeline asked about the catalog, but Isabel asked back if that was not what ladies say when they want to get off topic. She said that Ian would burn her with his gaze and asked Madeline if she was a psychic, could see the future or talk to the dead. The girl cheerfully said no, but stopped a little in surprise. She looked at the girl in surprise when she heard her ask if she understood how mysterious she was. After all, she knew the name of her lover and what she was going to do. She asked if Isabel really wanted to kill herself, but she started screaming and said she just wanted to go for a drive, albeit drunk. The girl sullenly asked if Isabel understood what stupidity this was. Isabel, hearing that the girl did not want to save face when she spoke about propriety, said that she spoke like one of her acquaintances. Madeline asked with surprise who it was, and Isabel only replied with a smile that it was an old friend, and that something told her that they would also become good friends. Still smiling, Isabel said she wanted to say something because she liked Madeline. She said that her brother wants to invite the girl to their estate. He looked around at the girls as his sister smoked a cigarette, and Madeline herself reflected that in this version of her life, she thought, everything was different. But fate, as she understood, still takes her to the past. When her father was displeased that she didn't wear pink, the girl said she had no desire to dress brightly when they went to ask for financial help. The father showed the letter, saying that it was not from the Earl of Nottingham, but from his eldest son specifically for her. The father was visibly pleased, but looked surprised at his daughter, who told him not to expect too much. She said that the Nottinghams were an old and well-known family, and it was unlikely that any of them would be interested in the daughter of a bankrupt baron. She bet Ian hadn't even written that letter, but her father had asked her not to be so mean. With shining eyes, he said that Mr. Nottingham had sent this invitation, though he knew of their present condition, but they need to sway him to their side in order to receive any financial assistance. Madeline thought that this man definitely did not want to propose to her, but was only fulfilling some of his moral obligations. The servants bowed respectfully, welcoming them to the estate when Madeline and her father arrived. The girl looked in a daze at Sebastian, the butler, and thought that she had been thinking so much about Ian that she didn't think she could meet other people. The butler asked if something was bothering her, seeing her look, and the girl, pausing, answered that everything was fine. The father nearby stared in surprise. At the door stood the Earl with his wife Catherine, as well as his eldest son Ian. They welcomed Mr. and Miss Roenfeld into their home. Father said it was an honor to be invited to their house, and the Countess bowed, saying she was very glad to meet them. Bowing in a polite bow, Madeline with a smile thanked Her Majesty for the invitation and thought about the fact that in her past life she did not have time to meet Yen's parents. She remembered the broken glass photo she had seen in the past and remembered that the Earl had been stricken with illness and died before the war, and Lady Catherine was fading after the loss of her 2 children. Now she was looking at these people who seemed much better and warmer than the portrait she had mentioned. With a smile, Madeline watched the Count and his wife, who, despite his illness, were visibly happy. Breaking her out of her thoughts, Ian held out his hand to the girl and beckoned her with him. Taking his hand, she went up the stairs and thanked him for his help. The man was visibly smiling. The girl could see that the estate was not what it used to be. The people here were full of energy and were just playing tennis when she and Ian came over and watched the game. She couldn't help but smile when she realized that everyone here was enjoying life, and the Nottingham estate was not at all what she remembered it to be. And now she saw Ian in a new light. They looked at each other at the table, and the girl thought about the fact that if the family had not experienced grief before her arrival, then he too would be completely different. The girl blushed, thinking that if she had been here earlier, things might have turned out differently for her and Ian. The Earl of Nottingham asked if they had enjoyed their dinner, and her father said yes, for even the tea was delicious. When asked, Madeline stopped her cup halfway through the cup with a smile and said it was hard for her to put into words how grateful she was. Bowing her head and lowering her eyes, she thought it was too late to bring the conversation to their financial situation. The Earl stood up, saying that they would not disturb the young men. Father and Lady Catherine also rose to Madeline's complete surprise. Returning to her, her father whispered to her to be obedient and not throw away any grasshoppers. Ian told her not to get up and that he would get up himself. It didn't sound very good, but he didn't give it time to think about it. And then he surprised her even more when he got down on one knee in front of her and looked her up and down. The girl did not believe what was happening, widening her eyes and frowning. Visibly worried and blushing, the man asked if she would marry him. She asked in surprise why, but he said that he understood that he had taken her by surprise. He said that he had heard rumors of her family's bankruptcy, and the girl turned away with irritation, asking how that had anything to do with the proposal. Frowning slightly, Ian said that he could give her what she needed and that he had already discussed it with her parents, so there was no need for her to be involved. And then he took out a beautiful ring and, opening the box, told Miss Roanfield that he was proposing to her hand and heart. Madeline was visibly displeased when she heard that Ian wanted his father, who has obvious health problems, to see his wedding. The girl, clenching her fists, asked if he loved her, watching her husband unblinkingly. Getting up from his knees, he came closer and said that he would not call his feelings for her so short-lived. This made her listen more carefully. He said that what he felt could be called sympathy and likeness of views, for she had interesting views and seemed more sensible even than her father, though he apologized for the latter. He remembered how she said that she wanted to live and not depend on anyone, and he would be the best partner in such a relationship. Looking into her eyes, the boy said that he wanted the lady of his heart to be sensible and not naive, like girls from other estates. With her head bowed, she told herself that he was always trying to buy her affection. But he began to say that he had never tried, but the girl interrupted him by calling his name. Walking past him and making him turn his head towards her, she said that she did not come here to get married. Ian grabbed the girl's hand, asking if she needed time to think and what the matter was. Stretching out her hand, she cried out that she did not want to sell herself to a man because of her father's debt, and that she did not want to step on the same rake. The puzzled boy lowered his eyes, wondering what she meant. And this offer is joint help to each other, and he did not want to belittle it. She made him clench his hands into fists in helplessness as she told him, looking him straight in the eye, that they couldn't be together. Looking down, Ian asked for at least a reason because he had a feeling that she thought he was a fool. But the girl was looking directly at him, saying that they were destroying each other, and that was the reason. He turned and left, while the girl turned her back on him as well. She thought that she should not have come here at all. In her past life, she sat and, covering her face with her hands, cried. She was thinking about Corey because last night it was raining and suddenly something happened to him. But Sebastian, who entered the room, also brought Corey. He was barking happily. Sitting next to the dog, the girl happily stroked him while the dog licked her face. The butler said a little awkwardly that the gardener had found the dog. It got wet and dirty, but nothing critical. Hugging the dog, Madeline said that it was wonderful and asked where the gardener was because she should thank him. Saying that he was just doing his job, Sebastian was nervous, which earned Madeline a surprised look. He announced that Mr. Nottingham had caught a cold. She asked anything, but she also asked how bad he was. Although the girl heard that the doctor ordered her to lie down and that she was told not to go upstairs, she stood in front of the door to his room. Realizing that she needed to make sure that he was all right and that this was no ordinary coincidence, the girl entered the room and immediately noticed the puddle. She looked up at the wet cloak, from which water still dripped, and thought that this could not be. He did not take care of the dog when they saw each other outside. She stood there wondering if Ian had been looking for Corey himself while it was raining. Then why didn't he tell about it? And Sebastian made up a story about the gardener. He was lying in bed and wheezing, feeling noticeably unwell. Ian's forehead, the girl realized how high the temperature was. Picking up the girl he saw dimly, he called out to her. The Count thought it was his sister Isabel, who died in an accident before the war. He began to sob, asking his sister for forgiveness because he felt very guilty. Squeezing his hand, Madeline asked him to calm down and said that she was not Isabel but his wife. When he heard it was her, Madeline Nottingham squeezed her hand even tighter. Ian called her name again, blushing and starting to smile. Sitting by the bed, she noticed a red rose standing alone in a vase. It was the same rose that someone had cut from its bush. Ian was on the battlefield, where they were shouting to retreat. Everyone around was injured or dead. Everything was on fire. He stood there with a rifle, before hearing that the enemy was advancing and that the soldiers were wounded. But he did not retreat himself, did not order to leave. Waking up, the Count screamed from the nightmare, clutching the sheet painfully. Sitting on the bed, he covered his face with his hand and tried to get back to normal, thinking that it was the same horror again. Madeleine, who held his hand even in all his dreams, fell asleep sitting next to him. He wondered what the girl was doing in his bedroom and wondered if she cared about him. Ian even smiled, thinking that whatever the reason was, he was feeling much better. Her hand pulled him out of his terrors and soothed him in his sleep. Thinking back to himself when they were married, he understood that marriage was a necessity, an inferior wife for an inferior earl. Then he looked at himself in the mirror and thought exactly that. Remembering how he watched her and the dog, he thought that she was simple and naive because Green has no idea about the horrors of war, and he is broken by that war. Once, Ian was going through the documents and asked Sebastian if he thought Madeline would be alone with the dog. And then, when he cut her rose and looked at his wife through the window, the man thought that she had found a way into his world, and he into hers. As he sat in bed now, he wondered darkly if he had any right to be with her at all, since he could drag her into his own hell. Madeline raised her head sleepily, looking at her husband and saying that he had already regained consciousness. She awkwardly took his hand away, saying he had a terrible fever, but he said he was fine now. After asking how Corey was, the Count remembered that Madeline had said she wanted to go to the movies. She flinched in surprise, asking why he was saying that. Returning to the window where her rose stood, the Earl said that she could now leave the estate whenever she wanted, and he would not keep her here by force. She asked if he expected thanks from her, but the man calmly answered that he wanted to protect her, because the world is very dangerous, and now she can go whenever and wherever she wants. When she asked if the world was suddenly safer, Ian clutched the sheets until his arm hurt. Without turning his face to her, he said that he simply did not want to drown her in his hell. Feeling pity, she told him not to say such a thing. Dangling his feet off the bed, Ian replied that silence wouldn't negate the fact that it was true. When he got up and, leaning on his stick, left, asking her to call Sebastian to him, the girl called Ian. Without turning to him, she said that he could pick as many roses as he wanted, because this was his garden too. The Earl of Nottingham was visibly surprised, trying not to smile, but a slight smile did appear on his face. He thanked, thinking that this relationship could be better and that it could be his last chance. The girl placed tea and a table next to the Count, asking how he was feeling. The man replied that it was acceptable. She blushed a little, thinking that he had become more polite since that day of his illness. Before, he wouldn't even answer her. Taking the book from the shelf, she enthusiastically asked if it was the first edition of Tamerlane the Great, and the man said that she wanted to take it to read if she wanted. Madeline turned to him in surprise, asking if he really meant that she could take him for herself. But then she began to make excuses, because she is taking her for a certain time, because she knows that the book is not hers. But he interrupted her and said that the book belongs to her. The girl was even more surprised when she heard Ian say that everything that was his belonged to her too. His garden is hers, and so is his office. It was the first time he had said that out loud. She was blushing and squinting at the man who was asking Sebastian how the fence was being rebuilt. He said that one should be ready if war suddenly came, and ordered the butler to take care of the fence. Madeline thought about the fact that he was always thinking about the war, and tried to think of at least some way to distract Ian from it. The girl thought that he probably liked old plays. She smiled as she came up with a distraction plan. Sebastian said that it was too much, because there is nowhere to arrange a film screening, and there is so much to prepare. That girl said with a smile that it is possible to arrange a show in the double chapel. The butler asked whether to arrange a reception as usual, but the girl said, putting her roses in a vase, that she wanted to do it perfectly, because it was the first thing that Ian asked. He widened his eyes in surprise when he heard that this estate was in need of a makeover. She asked with a smile whether it was time to start changing, because the war was becoming a thing of the past every day, and the estate and Yen and herself. The butler bowed, apologizing for not immediately being able to understand the deep message of what she wanted to convey to him. While she was thinking that Sebastian would continue to support her, one of the servants called out to him, drawing his attention. He asked where to put this trophy, and Sebastian answered to leave it in his room, and the girl said that she would return the trophy immediately after the holiday. The girl with a smile looked at Ian, who was walking on the second floor, thinking to himself if everything would really be okay. Madeline stood with a list of things while the men unloaded them and carried them to where they were needed. But she, while helping around the house, only thought about the fact that with all the liveliness in the estate, she was beginning to feel alive too. The girl looked out the window, seeing Ian and Sebastian. She understood that the Count was showing respect, because he did not interfere in everything she was doing. But she wanted to dispel all doubts, so now she stood in front of the door of the Count's room and timidly knocked. Entering after permission, the girl asked if he was still working, but Ian said that it was also a kind of rest. Blushing at the confession, Madeline said she was nervous because she was inviting so many people for the first time. She said she didn't want anything to go wrong. But Ian said that she had done a good job anyway. She happily said that she wanted to arrange a film screening after tea and asked if the Earl ever watched films. He said that only once, at an exhibition in Paris. Touching the man's shoulder, the girl said she hoped he would watch the movie with her then. The man stared at her, speechless, until Madeline said she was sure he would be interested. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, but then she went away and halfway wished him to rest. Standing under the door, the girl covered her face, which was red with confusion, with her hands. She thought she had finally said it. On the day of the movie screening, a lot of people gathered in the hall. Everyone stood in groups or pairs and talked. Looking around, the girl was happy, because a lot of people came, so everyone received invitations and did not ignore them. Everyone was whispering, and Madeline thought that everyone had come just to see the famous haunted mansion. She thought that because of so many people, Yen would definitely not show up today. Descending the stairs, the man introduced himself with a smile. He was Yen Nottingham, owner of this manor. The Earl looked at them all as they whispered and expressed his hope that they would have a good time and thanked them for their visit. He approached Madeline, limping, and apologized for being late, but she, putting down a glass so as not to disturb him, said that he was not late. The husband looked at his wife unblinkingly, catching every word and change of mood, while she smiled and said that they were just about to start the movie. But then she looked surprised at Ian, who offered to go together. It was something completely new for her. Taking her husband's arm, Madeline felt him shiver and asked if he was all right. She worried about him and his health and said that he should not overexert himself. But he turned his head to the girl, saying that it was no big deal and that it must be difficult to meet guests alone. As they walked, Ian said not to worry and that he really wanted to see the movie anyway. The girl asked, blushing a little, if he meant to watch the movie with her. She kept her eyes on her husband, wanting it to be the honest truth. It was clear that even the Count's ears were red with emotion, but he did not answer his wife. He only led her to the hall, where everyone was already gathering for the viewing. While waiting for a movie called The General to show, Ian asked his wife what it was, and she only replied that she didn't even know what it was about. Blushing, she corrected herself by saying that it was one of the most famous directors of their time, and that she thought people would like it. Ian looked at the people in the hall and said that Madeline did a good job. The girl was visibly laughing either at the movie or at the man sitting next to her, and she watched him carefully. He was watching the movie intently, but a slight smile was visible on his lips. Blushing, she thought she would have to thank Ian for coming, as she thought he would be sitting in his room. Now the evening seemed perfect for her. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not notice how the man next to her felt sick. He clutched his chest and trembled all over. The screen began to show the war, the horrors of which tormented him now too. Hearing the explosion in the room echoed on the screen, she turned to the man who was dealing with a panic attack and shaking all over. Lying on the back of another chair, he coughed and shook like an aspen leaf when the girl asked someone from the hall for help. Madeline screamed for help and hoped that Sebastian would hear her, or one of the servants or one of the guests would be able to help. When everyone left the hall and Ian was still in this state, Madeline turned her head to the sound. A man standing a few steps away said he was a doctor. The man said that the Count's symptoms resembled a nervous attack, so he needed rest and rest. While the girl cried and wondered at the man's behavior, he ordered the servants to take His Eminence to the bedroom in a commanding tone. The doctor also told them to put a cloth over his mouth because the Earl might bite his tongue, while the servants dragged Ian by the arms to the rooms. Madeline apologized to the stranger, once again asking if he was a doctor. Adjusting his glasses, the man replied that he had a doctorate in neuropsychiatry and had worked in a hospital for some time. He presented his business card, saying his name was Cornell Arlington and that he is the eldest son of Baron Arlington. With tears in her eyes, the girl thanked him for his help, saying that everything coincided so well. She did not think that then she would welcome her own death. The girl woke up on the sofa, on which she fell asleep, not even lying down, but simply lying down with her legs hanging on the floor. She was on the same day, June 28, 1914. It was this morning that shots rang out in Sarajevo. It was this morning that the war began with the Crimson Dawn. The man handed her a document saying she could live in the townhouse until the end of the month while he looked for her a new home. But her attention was drawn to a group of military boys, among whom she noticed a familiar face. She no longer listened to the person to whom she sold their townhouse. Madeline lowered her head sadly, seeing Ian in the crowd, who was going to war with the others. And underfoot lay a newspaper with the headlines that Britain had declared war on Germany. She remembered the huge queues at the station, people in which people were burning with patriotism, saw off with honors, and almost every man went to war to defend the country. And those who refused to go were called cowards and poked their fingers. They were not given a peaceful life and were not accepted in society, constantly being laughed at. She remembered a past life. She was as much a patriot as everyone else. As she read the newspaper and remembered Ian and his two faces before and after the war, she only thought that in her past life she had not known the price of blind patriotism. Her thoughts about the fact that now everything is different were interrupted by her father, who burst into the room and shouted in a drunken voice that she was a roach. Returning to her father, the girl frowned and asked if he had been drinking again. The man shouted that because of his daughter, he didn't have a penny left and he had to choke on this cheap drink. After all, if she had agreed to marry, then all this would not have happened. Father was sitting on the floor, having spilled the remains of his drink, and Madeline was telling him to stop and come to his senses. He froze at what he heard. She sold this house too, so they need to look for a new place to live. The man shouted that she was used to doing things her way and that she didn't listen to anyone, so he told her to think that he was no longer her father, and he would rather die alone than with her by his side. And then he continued to elaborate that he would rather buy a shack with the money he invested in her education and upbringing if he knew how it would all end, and that he was of no use to her. Realizing that the man who called himself her father had never loved her, the girl closed her eyes and thought that this was the end of it all. The father shouted that now she had no chance of getting married, because both of Nottingham's sons had already signed up for the volunteer service, and that she would die in poverty. And while her father didn't shut up, Madeline thought about herself. If Ian did go to war, doesn't that mean everything will go on as before? The girl thought that if this was the end, shouldn't she say something to Ian? She clearly weighed all the pros and cons. In her past life, Dr. Arlington treated Ian with shock therapy, tying him to an electric chair and recording him while he screamed in pain. The maid asked if it was really possible to treat people like that while they were watching a session in the Sparnica. Madame Madeline said it was the latest medicine. She put her hand to the door and, looking at one point in front of her, told the maids to trust the doctor. She tried her best to believe her own words. Ian was asleep, apparently dreaming, while the girl wiped his forehead with a cloth. She did it carefully and without haste, just to ease his condition. After apologizing for waking him up, the girl with pity in her eyes asked if he was having a hard time. After asking if she was on treatment, the man said only that he should recover. He said that if it is no longer possible to live like this, then one should make every effort to recover. This made Madeline blush faintly. The girl said that he had a good doctor who was a member of the British Medical Association, and the Earl said that the doctor promised that after curing him, he would take this experience to help others. When the girl again began to wipe the man's face with a rag, he told her not to worry, and that he would recover soon. He didn't look very good, and there were dark circles under his eyes. After interrupting her, Cornell entered the room Arlington and asked Madame Madeline to go with him because it was necessary to talk about her husband. As they drank tea in the living room, the man said that her husband was suffering from concussion attacks, and this was accompanied by even more shock. Cornell said that they are now using special methods to reduce susceptibility to such shocks. When he said that most war heroes recover after a course of treatment, the girl thanked him, saying that it was a joy. But Arlington said that there was no need to thank him because it was his job. Looking directly at the Countess, he said that as a doctor, he had to ask her something. He looked serious as he told Madame to stay away from His Eminence for a certain time. After the stimulus, the patient needs rest, and the Count must regain consciousness. Madeline rolled her eyes, not understanding why she had to stay away from her husband. She thought she might be able to help because he felt better around her. And Cornell went on to say that there should be no doubt about the treatment, for it is very much like cutting out a festering wound. She was confused because it was she who came up with the screening of the film, after which Ian became so sick and even now interferes with his treatment. But the doctor said that this is not the case, but asked to consider his words only as a recommendation that will maximize the effect of the treatment. He said she would communicate with the Count through him. Instead, while the girl was at a complete loss, he said that he would report on the Earl's progress every week because the absence of communication with her would help keep Ian's thoughts intact. Ian clenched his teeth painfully in excruciating pain as the doctor coldly told His Eminence to be patient. If he squeezed harder, the teeth would start to crumble. Arlington told him to be patient for his wife's sake and asked if that was why he felt sorry for her. The Earl's hands trembled when he heard that Madeline had to crawl out of her skin to take care of his crippled body from the doctor. While the Count was shaking in his chair, the doctor said, turning his back to him, that he should become a worthy husband for her. Taking out a syringe with some kind of liquid, he returned to the patient and said that first of all he had to learn to live without relying on others, and only after that there was real treatment. The Count looked at the doctor in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. Madeline and Corey woke up in the middle of the night to a scream that echoed throughout the estate. Remembering all this, she now thought that the treatment was just that. Remembering herself at that time, the girl reflected that she believed Arlington so much that she considered even the cries of pain as signs of improvement. She stood once in his room with the curtains closed, while Ian sat at the table by the candlelight. The girl thought that the number of Ian's seizures had decreased significantly, but he became even more gloomy than before. While he was writing something, not paying any attention to her, she asked Ian with a smile whether he should not open the curtains for them, because the sun was so wonderful that day. But he said that there was no need for this, and even on the contrary, she had to leave because she was only interfering with him. When she asked if he was feeling well, the husband said yes, without even taking his eyes off his papers or looking at his wife. She said with a smile, however, that she was glad to hear it, because he was better. Madeline started to talk about the book that interested her, but the Count said rather harshly that he seemed to have asked her to leave. She was surprised by this behavior. He looked at his wife darkly and angrily, saying that he hoped that she would no longer occupy him during his working hours. Sitting at tea with the doctor, she asked if the Earl was definitely on the mend, and Arlington looked at her with surprise and a little irritation. When the doctor gave her a book that should help understand His Eminence's condition, Madeline gasped, looking at the doctor. Cornell said that he hoped that she would be interested in the subject by giving him the book Horizons of Neuropsychiatry because it would be very useful to her, looking back at her husband's condition. He said, looking at the girl, that he thought she would make an excellent nurse. Something about him was off-putting, even though he tried to smile. Recalling what he saw, Arlington said she followed all the doctor's orders and took very good care of her husband. With a smile, he said that she was very talented and he would like to see her as his assistant. When he said he didn't think the Count could be helped anymore, she started yelling that he was saying that. And then she shouted that she trusted him, and now he says this. But he said with a smile that he meant that the situation would not improve in the way she would have liked. She was surprised to hear that the Count would not have fits, but asked if she was not tired of him. That is why he invited her to go on a trip with him and learn the work of a nurse. At the same time, the bird noticed a caterpillar which it caught and held firmly in its beak. This is exactly what was happening to Madeline now. Cornell caught her in his metaphorical beak, Arlington. When she heard about revenge against the man who imprisoned her, she wondered if she really wanted to be an obedient wife, as the doctor called her. And he continued, saying that he would let her study where she wanted and asked if she would go with him. In the little room behind them was eavesdropping on the maid, who covered her mouth with her hand so as not to make a sound. She was frightened and surprised by what she heard. The maid, who was standing at the door, told her friends what she had heard, and they said that the doctor was an insidious contagion if he called their madame to go. Both girls, hearing that the Countess did not answer anything, were surprised, and they began to insult Madeline, because without the Count she would be nobody, and he even gave her a puppy so that she would not be sad. Around the corner in the corridor stood someone who listened to the entire conversation and was in no hurry to make his presence known. They remembered how the lady ran away 2 years ago, saying that she could have met the doctor then, and they had a plan from the beginning. While the girls discussed their guesses, Ian Nottingham listened quietly, standing so that he could hear whatever else the gossips had to say. Widening his eyes with emotion and confusion, the Count did not even feel his hand shaking as it hit the stick hard. He accepted everything as the truth, not realizing that it was just gossip. Sitting in front of the fireplace in the room, he took out a bottle of alcohol and was now gradually destroying its contents. The only sound in the room was the crackle of wood burning in the fireplace. He wondered if she really wanted to leave him, because he had done so much more as her husband. Ian remembered everything that had happened during their married life. Burying his face in his hands, he thought he wanted to be closer to her and wondered if all her smiles were fake. He ordered himself to remember, to guess when she warmed to him, even though her face was stony every time they saw each other. And he remembered when he saved the dog. He wondered why she had come, even though he had told Sebastian not to let anyone in, what she was thinking when she was leaving him. Did she really hope that he would die? And that's why she called the doctor. Remembering her attack during the film, Ian thought that she knew exactly about the plot at the time, placing it precisely in its influence on the Earl. And she called people so that everyone could see this performance. He thought that she kept coming to watch his torture, and all this time she was waiting for the right moment to escape from a monster like him. He did not hear the knocking on the door because he was looking at his hands, which were shaking, and meanwhile, sweat was rolling down his face. Peeking into the room, the girl said it was her and asked if she could enter. Coming closer, Madeline asked if he could drink because she saw a glass and a bottle. She recalled that Dr. Arlington asked to abstain from alcohol. Clenching his hands into fists and looking at her with anger, he said that she was talking about him again and asked if she had also decided to become a doctor. And if they got close, it will definitely happen, he said. The girl trembled as she opened her mouth at what he said. She assured that nothing like that happened, and she only cares about him. He suddenly jumped off the girl, shouting that he is the master of this house and that no one has the right to order him. Madeline tried to justify herself, saying that she did not mean that at all. She said that now is the final stage of treatment, and the sooner it ends, the sooner the doctor will come. But he drew another Madeline, who whispered disgustingly that she was with him. All he saw were his own fantasies, where Madeline calls him a monster and says that she doesn't want to be with someone like him anymore and that she hates being around him. An imaginary girl took his face and said that even his pennies would not make her stay by his side, and it was long time for him to understand that everything is not so simple. But the real Madeline tried to pull him out of his own fantasies, calling him by name several times. She did not understand what was happening. While the imaginary one asked how he had the brains to think that she would be with him, the real one touched his face and tried to bring him to consciousness, asking if everything was okay. He, having heard that he was nothing, even though it was his invention, pushed his wife's hand away from him. All he listened to was the voice of the fictional Madeline. She did not understand what was happening, asking him, but he ordered to return to his room immediately. She widened her eyes at what she heard, as Ian said she should behave accordingly if she was already sold to him. The girl could not believe what he said. Looking at her with a crazy look and unblinking into her confused eyes, the Count said that she would have been on the street long ago without him. He pushed the girl unceremoniously, saying that if she had heard all she wanted, she could go back to her room and live a quiet life, as befits an earl's wife. Ian looked at the girl with contempt, frowning and even taking his hand away from her as if she were a leper. But he went. Having bypassed Madeline, he went to the door, leaving her alone. She stood there alone and, looking at one point, trembled. The girl did not understand what was happening and why their relationship had become such and what she had done to him to make him say such a thing.